Thank you for having me, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak here today. I want to preempt this paper with a brief content warning, as I will be showing photos of real dead animals and animated dead people. There's nothing extremely gruesome in here, but just so you know. So my paper is called Umurangi Generation, Photographic Framing and Apocalyptic Anticipation in the Contemporary Ecogame, and it showcases some of the work that I've been doing for my dissertation on the interrelation of apocalyptic anticipation and the climate crisis in contemporary ecogames. Specifically, it's part of my research on pre-apocalyptic photography games and the function of the camera in in-game apocalypses. I consider the role that ecogames, which work with simulated photography as a central gameplay element, play within this space by way of considering Origame's digital 2020 game Umurangi Generation. For this, I briefly consider the function of photography in negotiating real-world climate crises and the effective transitivity of the apocalyptic rhetoric within which eco-collapse photography is framed. I then provide a brief overview over the role of photography in video games at large, and then I turn to my case study, Umurangi Generation, in order to think together its ludic approach, namely content-centered photography as a central gameplay element, and its apocalyptic aesthetic and narrative. I argue that Umurangi Generation points to the communicative power of photographic framing through procedural, narrative, generic, and visual means, and that it thereby itself becomes rhetorically charged, a persuasive artifact. So, photography plays a crucial role in fostering an understanding of reality by means of the assumption of a visual truth that's invested in the medium. It thereby structures the way we think about our contemporary world and issues like the climate crisis. The argument goes that an image can, unlike pure text, communicate meaning through visual representation, and that such meaning can serve to inform us not only rationally, but it can also communicate an emotional component. It is precisely in this, what Butler calls the effective transitivity of photography, that the power of nature and crisis photography is located in. So when we see animals in peril, like this turtle that's stuck in plastic, or these giraffes that died of thirst, it makes graspable the impact of ecological cataclysms that showcase the irreversible human-induced changes to the structure and dynamic of our planet. The fact that over the last 30 years, the global giraffe population has dropped around 40%, and that the biggest challenge these giraffes are facing today is the droughts that are produced by man-made climate change and unsustainable farming practices is on its own harrowing. However, it becomes even more graspable through the photographic because it gives a sense of real representation of the fate thousands of giraffes have had to face due to man-made climate change. The photograph substitutes for the factual event to such an extent that it structures our understanding of reality more effectively than mere reflections of our understanding. Zielinska notes that the visual rhetoric of climate crisis photography has utilized the apocalyptic and the post-human as frequent aesthetic tropes in both fine art photography and news photography alike. Within this context, the apocalypse becomes an aesthetic and interpretive shorthand. It was like an apocalyptic movie, this Guardian article states. Through this, the climate crisis is mediated through an effectively charged aesthetic. Brand's Sink Rise series, for example, which depicts South Pacific islanders whose lands are under the imminent danger of being flooded, utilizes such apocalyptic aesthetics. Submerged underwater, Brand's subjects become symbolic stand-ins for, and I quote, the roller coaster ride towards apocalypse, towards environmental destruction. Sontag's assertion that photographs state the innocence, the vulnerability of lives heading towards their own destruction seems particularly pertinent in this context. Such photography, however, is not only emotionally evocative. Its clear goal is to be rhetorical, i.e. persuasive. On his own photograph, Brand writes that he is portraying what he fears will happen in the future in order to help people to see the devastating impact of their actions in the present. It seeks to emotionally orient the viewer towards some specific future by means of visual rhetoric. Similarly, as Stoyle argues in a paper on Greenpeace and the representational politics of climate change communication, much climate change activism privileges the visual over the factual because it has a certain emotional resonancy. However, empirical research complicates this notion and puts into question the actual impact of climate crisis photography with regards to affecting genuine action or even emotional stage conducive to positive change. And scholars have noted that a centering of the visual in climate change discourse happens at the risk of what is latent, immanent, or hidden. Further, it seems another instance of this preaching to the choir situation that we were already talking about yesterday. And the moment climate crisis can be photographed as an apocalyptic event is obviously the moment it also becomes visible as a symptom. It's too late to prevent the action because it's already apocalyptic in a way. The aesthetics of apocalypse then display fatality, something that has already been destroyed and cannot be brought back to life. Still, with the contemporary convictions of the persuasive effect of climate crisis photography in the back of our minds, how can we conceive of apocalyptic in-game photography? And what even is video game photography? To briefly discuss this, I will pull a classic humanities move and give you the Cambridge Dictionary definition of photography as taking of pictures using a camera and try to apply this to the game space. If we try to do this, we're already confronted with a plethora of issues. What we might ask what really counts and what does not count as photography or a camera in this context. If I use my phone's camera to take a picture of my screen that is displaying a game, is that different from screenshotting the game by using the print button on my computer? Are the screenshot artists of the Undead and Thrills group on the photography website Flickr, which you can see here in the bottom right-hand corner, really photographers as they themselves assert? While this group emphasizes photographic practices such as the importance of aspect ratio and framing, can a screenshot even count as photography if there is no physical camera involved? What about the increasingly popular and fittingly named photo modes that let you control camera angle, saturation, and lighting, but again do not use an actually photographic lens? What is more, how does this then differ from games that actually simulate a camera, and thereby the phenomenology of photography? And can we really fit games like Viewfinder, which is on the upper right-hand corner here, in which the act of taking a picture manipulates the in-game world within the same definitory frame as Life is Strange, where a camera is essential to the narrative, but you don't really get to take a picture yourself ever? Well, I'm not interested in answering all of these questions or even providing like an ontological definition of in-game photography. I hope to show that in the realm of gaming, photography can denote very different acts and representations in gaming and metagaming practices alike. Therefore, a more nuanced framework of in-game photography is required to narrow down the type of photography that I'm specifically interested in this presentation. Luckily, Möhring and de Moutis provide a helpful taxonomy of in-game photographies. Note the plural here, which indicates the diversity of photographic practices with an approach to the family resemblance rather than one distinct definition. This serves to bring some order to the chaos, though I also feel like it's not really clear-cut. So Möhring and de Moutis differentiate between artistic screenshotting, which is taking a screenshot, and it can be an artistic practice like the Flickr images, a photographic mode of photographic modding, where you have a suspended gameplay condition and the photographing is happening on a different ontological level than the actual gameplay, and games in which photography is central to the gameplay condition, i.e. part of the core mechanic of a game's gameplay, which does not take place on such a separate ontological level. So these are some examples where you can see like a Safari photography game where actually the photography is the gameplay in a way. All of these engage with photography in different ways, necessitate different practices, and place different levels on significance on the practice of taking pictures. Well, it's possible to beat The Last of Us Remaster without ever entering photo mode. We can't beat Safari Photo Africa Wild Earth without taking a picture because photography is the central gameplay condition. So within games in which photography is the central gameplay condition then, there's a further useful distinction to make between what Poremba refers to as content-centered or practice-based photography games. In content-centered games, players need to capture a certain image or object for maximum points, and in practice-based games, points are awarded based on size, pose, and technique. Though to me, this distinction is rather sliding than binary. It's useful for identifying what type of photography is rewarded in what way in photography games. So why am I going on about this in so much detail? I want to highlight that for the purpose of this paper, I'm only interested in content-centered photography games in which photography by means of a simulated camera is a necessary gameplay condition. And these are some examples. In these games, photography, often decidedly analog, is remediated through its simulation in a digital game, whereby the content of photography is of primary interest rather than the frame's aesthetic composition. Some examples for this type of photography game may be the shutter missions of Pilotwing 64, the photojournalism in Dead Rising, the new Pokemon Snap, Fatal Frame, and Seasons: A Letter to the Future. And now we turn to the actual game that I want to talk about, which is Umurangi Generation. So Umurangi Generation, released by Origame Digital in 2020, is also a content-centered photography game which takes place in a pre-apocalyptic New Zealand that has been thrust into turmoil as invaders resembling blue bottle jellyfish attack Aotearoa. The island's government and its citizens are living out their lives at the brink of collapse, with the United Nations deploying soldiers and mechs to defend their nation. The Prime Minister has fled the country, showcasing political negligence, and the outbreak of a contagious parasite adds a further layer of dread and chaos to an already tense situation. The player takes on the role of a Maori photojournalist for the Tauranga Express, who is vaguely tasked to document these events with their analog camera, photographically framing the transition from apocalyptic anticipation or pre-apocalypse to full-blown apocalypse. Equipped with different lenses and tasked with photographing a variety of objects such as 3 birds or 2 body bags, the player explores the story world with their Maori friends, Mika, Atauru, Kete, and Pengi, a chain-strapped penguin. They navigate various settings, which make graspable the immense pressure and oppressive occupation that New Zealand's population is under, but the game simultaneously points to indigenous resiliency in the face of crisis. While the player starts off taking pictures of walled-off cities and train stations, these spaces soon transform to deadly zones of war. And I think there's something to be said about like mirroring stages and affect here. I just haven't quite figured out what. But while the player starts off in-game advertisements and graffiti add more depth to this narrative by revealing a society in which a local resistance against UN forces and their occupation of New Zealand is growing, reflecting a tension that is more multi-layered than the traditional us versus them rhetoric of alien invasion fiction. Through this, the game deals in themes of colonialism, reflecting a deeper tension that complicates the terms invading aliens and human defenders. Though we get to decide what we photograph, we are punished by the game for photographing the actual arbingers of apocalypse, the blue bottle jellyfish-looking aliens. As the player then photographs the different game spaces, the tension is frequently spelled out through the image of climate collapse, advertisements about making your home flooding proof, and graffitis about the rampant escalation from local disaster to apocalyptic crisis. They litter the game world. Generally, the game's narrative is told through purely environmental means, though Umurangi Generation's oppressive score and increasing off difficulties certainly add to it. There's no narrative voice, no mise-en-scène or cutscenes, and the reward mechanics, which we will turn to shortly, are more satire than actual rewards. Still, the game's narrative is undoubtedly about the failure of government in the face of crisis of an apocalyptic scale, and most pressingly, these crises are framed as ecological. Correspondingly, the game's lead director, Terry Faulkner, has stated that the concept of the game's story and themes came from my experience with the bushfires and the shithouse job that the Australian government did, not only at reacting to them, but ignoring the issue of climate change for years. Amidst this blend of cyberpunk and anime aesthetics, the game hence seeks to draw attention to contemporary eco-crises and can therefore be referred to as an eco-game. Returning now to our previous considerations of photography and the photography game, I want to now think about the ludic and the content-centered photography game in which photography is a central gameplay condition and interrogate this mode of play in relation to Umurangi generation's themes. At its core, the game works on two levels. One, maybe the more overt one, draws attention to the rhetorical function of framing crisis by means of photography, and the other interrogates the function of generic structures and reward systems in games depicting crises. The content-centered approach fully puts questions of aesthetics into the hands of the player. As the tutorial puts it, you are not going to be judged on what is or isn't a good photo. Art is subjective after all. Though the game sometimes specifies that certain pictures are to be taken with specific lenses, their specific framing remains up to us. However, through our aesthetic decisions, we can actually influence the way that the apocalypse is going to be received by a broader public, because we're photojournalists. We are interlocutors in the communication of crisis, war, and the apocalypse. And how we frame the end of the world is going to have a direct impact on the reality of our newspaper's readers. Sure, we are tasked with photographing 3 birds, but will we photograph these birds located in front of our friends who are just holding a breakdancing competition? Or are we going to photograph these birds in front of some graffitis protesting the UN? Well, the first picture will tell an almost romantic story about cultural identity, communal resilience, and kinship structures in the face of the end of the world. The other will tell a story of civil unrest and protest against what is articulated as neo-colonial interventionism. Thereby, the player's position as photographer puts them in a role of epistemic authority in which they get to decide how to aesthetically and thereby effectively communicate the end of the world. The almost complete freedom in photographic framing, i.e. the game's content-centered approach, plays a key role in communicating this authority to the player. Because the objectives of the game dictate what we photograph, but not how we photograph it, or how we adjust exposure and saturation, we can take a clear picture of the alien invaders or keep them lurking in the dark, obfuscated by low exposure. Through this, the tools of photography themselves become tools of power. I think I might skip the Long Butler quote, but basically what we see as this tool of power is actually showing that photography in itself is already interpreting the world around us. Moreover, while in theory we're free to include and exclude in the frame whatever we want, the game weakly incentivizes the player not to take pictures of blue-bottle jellyfish-like beings because they are invading the planet by subtracting money from their rewards. Though the money plays no role in the mechanics of the game, apart from maybe counting as a high score, it's the end of the world after all, this reward structure still communicates that the people paying us, potentially the editors at the Tauranga Express, would rather we keep that whole alien thing out of our reporting as much as possible. Of course, whether we choose to do so or not does not have any far-reaching consequences. Still, the reward structure of the game presents as a dissenting editor, an invisible regulatory force that is fine with showcasing resilience and even death and destruction, but not the actual reasoning for people suffering. This is in itself rhetorical in that it steers the player towards certain actions and away from others by employing the aesthetics of a reward system that follows a capitalist market logic. Most importantly, however, Umurangi generation's performance of photography casts a critical perspective on the process of media production, opening up interesting discussions in relation to knowledge production in social and activist contexts. I've hinted at, but until now largely glossed over the function of genre in Umurangi generation, and I'm also running out of time, so I'm just briefly going to touch on this. The commonalities between the photography game and the first-person shooter have been identified by many people, and just consider, for example, the extended metaphor that connects the handling of guns with the handling of cameras. Think of the shooting of photographs or the loading of cameras with magazines of film, which also bleeds into the gameplay of Umurangi generation, specifically in what we might call a speedrun light mode. So to briefly summarize and come to an end, content-centered photography games provide an interesting lens, literally, through which the apocalypse can be approached. Games like Umurangi Generation, but also Season, A Letter to the Future, utilize photography to make players consider their relationship to an increasingly apocalyptic-seeming environment and tap into a broader and contentious discourse about the communicative function of crisis photography, its apocalyptic aesthetics, and the knowledge hierarchies it constructs. Lastly, I want to briefly appreciate that due to time and expertise constraints, this paper has failed to adequately interrogate the indigenous symbolism of Umurangi Generation, particularly in relation to photography, since throughout colonial history, the camera has also itself acted as a tool of violence against colonial subjects. This needs to be investigated further. Thank you.